Our special guest today is Rachel Pearson. Rachel is the founder and chief executive officer of Engage for Women. Engage for Women is a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting women's economic security through bipartisan and common sense solutions. What a novel idea, Rachel. Rachel has extensive experience in elective politics, providing strategic planning and counsel for Fortune 500 companies, leading associations, social impact organizations, nonprofits, and individuals. Her dedication to bringing together members of Congress, senior staff, and corporate leaders is widely recognized by both sides of the aisle as unique and constructive. And it was that drive for coming together to find common sense solutions, repeat, common sense solutions, that inspired her for founding Engage for Women in November of 2018. Rachel Pearson, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Thank you so much for having me. My next step forward was to jump in and do something really, really hard. Your music is just to jump in and do the thing that nobody thinks is possible. So there you go. But I'm delighted to be here.
No, really looking forward to our conversation today. And before we dive into the weighty issues of economic security, voting trends, and bipartisan policymaking, let's get to know you. You have extensive experience in elective politics, as well as strategic planning and counsel for corporations, nonprofits, social impact organizations, and many others. Tell us about your career and why you were drawn to elective politics, strategic planning, and serving the clients that you've served, beginning with your very first foray into elective politics and why you're so motivated to do that.
My very first, I'm going to go one step before my first elective campaign job, my first foray to campaign politics, because I worked for a governor of Ohio. That was the first time that I, quote unquote, worked for the taxpayer in an official capacity. And that was George Voinovich from Ohio, God rest his soul. And then I left his office to work on a Senate campaign, which we lost. My first campaign was a losing campaign. It was then Mike DeWine, who ended up being a senator and is now currently governor of Ohio, but he ran for the Senate in an ill-fated campaign against John Glenn. And that was my first exercise in campaign politics. And I did that and was bitten by a bug. Fast forward by a little bit, Mike DeWine ran again. He said, come work on my campaign. I did. He won this time, said, come to Washington with me. Or maybe I said to him, I want to go to Washington. That's probably more what I did. And he said, I will take you to Washington. So I worked on his Senate staff for a brief period and then left to open a campaign business, if you will, campaign election consulting business, and officially became part of the swamp. So I think that, but it was those two men in Ohio that brought me to Washington that sort of launched it all.
Setting aside Engage for Women for the moment, what have been some of the favorite projects or causes and favorite people you've worked with over the years, and what ranks them so high?
I'll do sort of one. For one, I'll say a group of people, which is Engage related, but not. And that is my favorite people, and some of the people that I admire most in the world are family caregivers. People that are caring for an aging parent, a sick child, or someone in their family who needs their help. That strain both emotionally, financially, physically, I find incredibly admirable. Recently, I lost my mom, and my dad had been her caregiver, and watching that was quite something to see. And then spending so much time with women that are caregivers. To add a name, if you will, or one or two names, I think top of mind for me right now that Engage has been celebrating is the work of Senator Marsha Blackburn and Senator Blumenthal from the state of Kentucky, who passed it's called the COSA bill, which is Kids Online Safety Act, which passed the Senate 91-3, which I think is an accomplishment that cannot be heralded enough in this day and age. So I admire Senators Blackburn and Blumenthal for their tenaciousness and building the coalition necessary to get that kind of vote in the Senate.
A former guest and a current Voice America host, Donna Rice Hughes, was instrumental in that legislation. So I'm very familiar with that. So I appreciate you flagging that and raising it.
Oh, I'm honored to do it.
I couldn't help but notice you founded Engage for Women in November of 2018. So I'm assuming that was just after that year's general election. Was there any significance in that timing?
I could try and be coy and say no, but that wouldn't be true. I, like many people, was a bit unnerved by what was happening in the political world around me, what I saw happening in my political family of origin, which is the Republican Party, and if I can be more specific, the Midwestern Republican Party of George Voinovich and Mike DeWine and others. So I was trying to find a way to process that constructively. And I also what had been doing, as you mentioned at the top, doing a lot of convening. So those things intersected. The fact that I was really spending a lot of time with Republicans and Democrats together very intentionally. And so getting the ringside seat to those relationships, which were so respectful, so enthusiastic, and yet as frustrated as we all feel out in America looking in, those were some of the things that prompted it. It was either I had as I often say, I had to put all my anger somewhere. There was also not just anger, there was hope and energy and trying to make things better, but there was also a lot of sort of anger and frustration.
As you've gone through the bipartisanship world, have you done any work with organizations like No Labels or others who are trying to find the purple, if you will, in America?
I have. The folks at No Labels, a number of those at the very top in the leadership No Labels are very, very good friends of mine, and I have tremendous respect for their courage and also their commitment and love of country. I participated in some early No Labels sort of conversations many years from where they have been in sort of their evolution in the last year or two. Ultimately, it was not the right fit for what I was looking to do, but I am admiring of the fact that they coalesced what is actually the same audience in many ways that is the Engage audience. We just are offering and doing different things, but it taps into the same energy, the same frustration, the same group of people, I believe.
So Nancy Jacobson has been a guest there in the past, and a little bit off topic here, but just staying with the bipartisan concept, they really pushed hard this year for that third party candidate, probably the most they've done since their inception. Your own personal view, been in the political arena, why is it so difficult to get that third party involved?
I think we still like our two party identity in this country in a way. We grudgingly like our elephants and our donkeys. I mean, we're still relatively young. We don't have a long history of mutations of the Whig Party and the Tory parties and all of those things. I mean, we're mutating a lot right now, I would make the argument, within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. That's a very sort of uneducated, unpolitical scientist answer, but I think fundamentally it's been a way that we've thought about our political activity for such a long time, our political engagement, if you will, such as it is. I think it's hard to break that, and so I think that's was part of their challenge, and in their defense, the two political parties reared their head at the idea of a third party candidate. So they poked, as the expression goes, No Labels did a fine job of poking the bear. And I would say also, to their credit, poked a bear of where power derives. And they are not, although I disagree with a third party candidate in some cases, right now, I do not disagree with them about many of their frustrations and the role that political parties play that's destructive for both of them.
I appreciate that insight. What inspired you to focus on bipartisan solutions for women's economic security, especially when there's been such a partisan divide since 2018?
In one of those moments, sort of aha moments, as you hear people have, I was sitting at dinner with a pollster, and I'd been in and around campaign politics, in and around members of the United States Congress for a long time, and said, women are the majority, the voting majority in nearly every congressional district in this country. And I thought, wow. I mean, I knew that, but I thought about it in a totally different way. And the second evolutionary thought, at least for me at that dinner, was I looked across at the women at the table that were part of a small conversation. I thought, why is it that I don't look at you and feel like we're the majority? Why is it that I don't look at you and feel like, okay, we've got this? Like we're going to decide, like we can have control over the agenda. We can help prioritize the agenda. And I thought, I don't feel that at all looking at other women. So when I realized that, and I realized our elective power, um, then as Engage has trademarked, that led to the trademark of the phrase that women outnumber, outvote, and outlive men, which is very central to the way that I try and think about coalescing us as the majority, which I think needed some reframing and needed a little rebranding, if you will.
How do you define economic security for women? And is it all different from the economic security for men and couples?
Uh, yes and no. I mean, as I always say, a woman's economic security, oftentimes she's responsible for the economic security of her husband. If she's the primary breadwinner, she's responsible for the economic security of her children. If she's a solo mom or a divorced mom or a single mom, or she's caregiving and paying for some of the healthcare bills of her parents. So it's they're impossible to separate, but I do believe that the challenges to women in the workforce do have some unique aspects that obviously men do not have. But I also am always very clear to say there is no women's economic security without some very good men. And I also want to just say as well that I'm very careful to make the point that men can legislate very responsible economic security for women. They may not do it as much as I would like, but this idea that men can't pass responsible policy for women or that they've never done that is absurd. But there are some unique experiences that women have economically that I think deserve us looking at our issues on our own.
Before I forget, where can people find you?
Engagewomen.org, and I am Rachel at engagewomen.org.
Thank you. Issues these days tend to be pigeonholed into women's issues and men's issues. Make the case that economic security for women is not just a women's issue.
Well, it's a pure economic engine issue for the United States. For instance, women are a very large percentage of people in creating and building small businesses. Small business, as you know, is what is it? It makes up. I was looking at some figures last night. It makes up 44% of our national economy. Women, I often say, either by are entrepreneurial either by design or necessity, by desire because they've got the urge, or out of necessity because they've got to survive and figure out a way to do it. So we are part of the workforce in every way. When we leave the workforce, there are great challenges to the American economic engine working, as we saw during COVID. So you cannot take us out of the equation at any level because we fuel it. I mean, we're equal partners in workforce and generating the American economy and making it grow.
And as we think about economic security, we also have to look at the other side of the coin. What factors lead women to economic insecurity that may not or do not affect men as profoundly?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that, and this is not every woman's story, but it is the majority of women's story. And that is that women end up being the mothers and the wives and the caregivers quite often. And so one of the things that makes Engage unique is that we talk about the economic threat of a woman's life. And it should be obvious, but it particularly in the nonprofit and public policy world where things get so siloed, which I understand, because it's difficult to do everything. You have to be very focused to be successful. But one thing leads to another. I mean, that young girl, when she takes her first breath, if she doesn't have food, if she doesn't have an education, if she doesn't have an emotionally stable home, if she doesn't have love, all of that is going to affect her ability to go to her next stage of development. And you see this over and over. I mean, not you see it over and over. One thing leads to the next thing in the data. If a woman can't read by the time she's in sixth grade, her education is significantly off track in the beginning. If a young girl, young lady has not received her high school diploma, she's automatically in a very tougher position to accrue wealth over the course of her life. And we see this crescendo. If we think about the thread holistically, she then may leave the workforce to have her children. Her marriage, if she has one, God willing, will be successful, but 50% of marriages in this country end in divorce. It may not be successful, in which case women never do well in divorce. She may be a single mom who's decided to blaze that trail for herself. She may just be a single woman who ends up in her 40s when she should accumulate her highest degree of wealth, ending up having to leave the workforce to take care of her parents. So all of this, the thread of a woman's economic life is the successive steps that a woman lives that affect her ability to accrue wealth and ultimately have what I would hope for everybody, and for women in this case, is a dignified retirement. And it's also why it's important early on, as I said earlier, as I mentioned, that women outlive men. They can outlive men quite significantly, which means that they are responsible in many cases for their own retirement. We have 46% of Black women in this country which retire into poverty. I think the number is 20, I think it's number something like 25% of people in this country live solely on Social Security. That makes having a dignified retirement pretty darn hard. But it's Engage seeks to be a new voice in the conversation. Well, not so new anymore, hopefully established voice that's reminding everyone that these things are interconnected, which is obvious, but you get so siloed in your work to remember that one impacts the other.
In what ways does the gender wealth gap, not just wage gap, influence women's long-term economic stability compared to men?
I think that it does tremendously, and I think that I am not an economist to debate it. There is clearly a gender gap, but in many ways, less reported is that the gender gap is equaled in some ways as well too for people starting out. The big challenge is when women leave the workforce to have children, and that we just don't have easy solutions for that. So two people now can enter the workforce, a young man and a young woman can enter the workforce, and so much work has been done. It's not perfect, but more often than not, they are often paid the same wage. And they're, accumulating and doing well. And then the first big moment happens, which is the woman has that baby and has to be a mom and decide what she's going to do. And then the burden of childcare costs and everything else enter into play. So they have to make those family decisions. And that then is where the separation and the wealth gap really, really happens. Is when women start to make decisions about if they're going to have a family, and what responsibilities they are incumbent upon them in that choice.
As you note on your website, the American economy is changing rapidly because of automation, the expansion of the gig economy, trade disruption, and the growth of the information economy. Those forces must affect different women, millennial women, self-employed, women about to retire, women just joining the workforce, in many different ways. Is economic security for women different depending on their age?
Sure. I mean, obviously, yes. A woman starting out would have no nest egg. An older American woman may decide that she wants to be in the workforce for mental stimulation. She may be prepared for retirement, or she may have some for retirement, but she wants a little bit more for retirement to do some things she wants to do. So, you know, naturally, you would just have to say that it's different. It can be different depending on how much work time is put in. To the earlier point about automation and AI, I'm like everybody worried and a bit unnerved about seeing a lot of jobs, particularly in the retail industry and other ways that are being in sectors like that were perhaps minimum wage jobs are slightly above, but where people are being replaced, if you will. That's probably too well. Some people would think that's exactly the right word. Others might take issue with it. But there's a segment of the population that was able to survive and make a living, and those jobs seem to be disappearing. And I'm very, very worried about that.
Engage for Women has 4 goals or priorities. Let's take them one at a time. The first is that its mission is, quote, to provide all American women, regardless of race, religion, or gender identity, with the keys to economic security. What are the keys to lifelong economic security, and how can you ensure that women attain them?
Well, that sounds very lofty that we say that, and a bit self-grandizing. So let me, some of that is, if you will, trying to inspire people. But to answer the question succinctly, what Engage works very hard to do at this moment and the nonprofit's life is to advocate for issues and legislation and educate around issues and legislation that will help women achieve their economic security, whether that's through responsible paid family leave legislation, whether that's through responsible child care legislation, but to talk about how these are the priority of American working women, and we need to come up with solutions to help them navigate the challenges in their life to get to reach economic security.
And the second, Engaged Women seeks, quote, to be a new women's movement which mobilizes elected, nonprofit, and corporate leaders to address economic security. Is there any part of past women's movements on which Engaged Women can build upon?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think there are things that inherently women like to do together. I think there are things men like to do together. That's not a a one and not the other. I think that when during COVID, particularly when I would meet a bunch of women on a screen who I'd never met before, and they'd never necessarily even met each other before, you would say things like childcare or caregiving, and you might as well have had fireworks go off. I mean, just in the sheer joy of having that commonality of experience, being able to talk about that commonality of experience with people that really understood it. So I do think there are unique challenges in women's lives that we like to talk to each other about. We feel connected. They know our struggle, we know their struggle, that sort of thing. So, and women are mighty when they set their mind to something, and that can be learned. I mean, obviously, Engage is a bit different in some things that we don't do, which you'll probably ask about, but generally speaking, a bunch of women together in a room, if they're single-minded or share a goal, is a pretty amazing force.
Why haven't existing women's movements addressed issues related to economic security, and how's Engaged Women filling that gap?
I think, and again, this is going to be very clear to everybody that's listening or reads this, is that this is not the only reason, but I think it is a reason. I think many women's organizations organizationally came together. Their mission was around issues of reproductive rights and right to life issues. And that historically was a fight that needed to happen. We're still in that fight, obviously. But that was a fight that was the core, if you will, the kernel of why women were coming together. And that's a different conversation than women's economic security. And so, because thoughtful women can disagree on their positions on that subject, um, we have never really felt our full majority power. That's why the big thing that makes Engage unique in many ways initially in our founding was that we decided that we were going to take those off the table of conversation, that being reproductive rights, right to life positions, and judicial nominations, which in hindsight, with this being the first presidential election, post Dobbs, I wonder if I would have done exactly the same thing, but I absolutely would have, because if women are 51% in the room, if they automatically take their sides on that issue, you're in the 25, 26 range, and you never collectively come together to feel your power. And you're also made to feel initially, if that is the first thing that you organize around, that you don't have commonality. When we know by all polling, and it's a lived experience for me with founding Engage, that 98, 99% of women, when their heads hit the pillow at the end of the day, are worried about their economic health and the economic health of their families. And but I also want to say very clearly on something that even I may hold as the single most important factor to vote on this year. Whether I do or not, the point that I want to make is there are multiple organizations on both sides of the issue where you can participate and activate and be engaged in. And those are organizations that are remarkably successful and in that fight. In fact, it is 9 cents, 90 cents of every dollar goes to reproductive rights in this country, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it. If women's causes are underfunded generally, and then 90 cents out of that dollar is going to reproductive rights, they have, they have cornered the market, if you will. And again, for reasons that are incredibly important and still are to numerous women. But the point in this, just in it, is we'll never feel our majority of our 51 or 52%. And the other side of that is how we agree on 98%, let's say, of everything when we're collectively together, unless we decide that potentially we may have to agree to disagree on that.
So it's not that simple.
Not that simple. But I say with love, you can belong to two organizations at one time. I mean, you can learn from Engage, you can learn about bipartisan legislation, you can get informed, you can participate in our events, watch us, use us as a barometer, and you can also belong to Right to Life, or you can belong to Planned Parenthood. I mean, those things one does not exclude the other in my mind.
The third pillar, and we talked about this somewhat with the first priority, Engage promotes the pillars of economic security, lifelong education, health and workforce, generational caregiving, and financial prosperity. We are guided by inclusion, innovation, and inquiry. What strategies are you using to ensure that this movement is inclusive of women from different socioeconomic, racial, and geographic backgrounds?
We are working very hard to not talk about women's numbers as a monolith. I mean, women are not a monolith, and the economic story for women of color is different than it is for, in some cases, for white women. But so we're doing it in a way that feels right to me, which is to be cognizant of it, to not be fast and loose about how we talk about women as if every woman's experience is the same. But I also believe that we have much more in common than we are different. And so if lots and lots of subgroups and identities is something that you want evaluated when you look at women's economic policy, you may not necessarily find everything that you're looking for with Engage, but we are trying to be incredibly responsible in being inclusive about women's experiences. And so much of that too is regional, as well as it is racial, as well as it is any number of things. But also, our North Star is that we are more alike than we are different. And that together we are the majority. So as the majority, why are we not imprinting more what the priorities are of our public servants?
How do you envision the role of younger women in this new movement, and how are you engaging the next generation of female leaders?
Young women, look, I've been as moved as anybody by seeing the political energy and the early voting by young women in this country. I'm excited that they are taken to the polls and that they're volunteering for campaigns, because it's the only way that democracy is going to survive and flourish. At the same time, and they go together, I'm excited to see them participating, because I'm really, really worried about the figures and the data that talk about the cynicism. Maybe I'm using that word, I'm not sure that they would, but the cynicism they feel towards our institutions. And I think in some cases, the lack of awareness and the lack of admiration for how we came to these institutions and how many people fought for them, died for them, defined them, and how they make the United States of America totally unique and the miracle that I think it is. So I'm very excited that young women are flying their flags and marching to the polls. And my biggest hope is that after this election is done, whether they are happy with the outcome or not, that they don't resort to cynicism or they don't result to being disrespectful to this country, which I would argue has given us more opportunity than perhaps anybody else realizes around the globe. So it's a double for me. They got to stay in it. As for future political, to answer the second part of your question, future women leaders, look, you got to run, and it's hard, and it's not for everybody. I'm a little bit of a contrarian about this, from the standpoint that I don't think the answer to everything is just to elect more women. I'm part of the swamp in Washington, and believe you me, women are every bit as partisan as men are. I mean, Speaker Pelosi, God bless her, got elected with the largest class of women in the House of Representatives a couple of election cycles ago. I didn't see those women locking arms, singing "Kumbaya," coming out of the Capitol steps saying, "Let's work together." So, power is just that, and partisanship is an important power signifier. But I think when more women are holding office, it makes a distinct impact on the conversations and priorities. And that's why my hope is that the representation becomes even more equal, just because of what women bring to it from their personal experience.
Are you familiar with an organization called the Policy Circle?
I am. Yes, I went to one of their lunches quite a while ago. Yeah.
I see a lot of synergies there. One of the co-founders, Sylvie Legere, has been on our show. And so as you're talking through this, I see a lot of things that could potentially be done together, which is great. And finally, Engage for Women celebrates bipartisanship. No matter who wins an election, it's the only path forward. Our country is so politically divided that celebrating bipartisanship and moving forward, no matter which party wins, is a Herculean, if not almost impossible task to accomplish these days. What's the cause of today's highly partisan political environment?
I don't think it's one factor. I talk about it as a knot, which may actually, upon reflection, may not be the perfect descriptor, but what I mean by that is that the various threads are so tightly coiled together, you can't, you have to look at it in some ways in its entirety. I do not think it's a solve one problem and this will all go away. But of the top of them, of course, which I'm sure have been discussed at length on your program, are the professionalization of politics is a way to make a living, the consultant class, the money spent on politics. That's certainly a factor. I think media bears an incredible responsibility, and the business of media has a lot to do with the situation we find ourselves in. But I would also say, and I say this a lot, and I think it shocks people a little bit, and it's my intent, but I also believe it's the truth. And I think it was Thomas Jefferson said, or amended one great French philosopher, of course, of which there are many, but you get the government you deserve. And I'm a little tired of sitting in rooms with everybody being mad at Congress and never turning the mirror on themselves. I mean, while many of us just sort of had faith that members of Congress would do the responsible thing for their countries, and we were living our lives or working on the weekends for survival, or taking our kids to sports practice, or like me, watching Law and Order reruns on the couch or something, the fringes on both sides of the political aisle took over the political parties. And so we have to contend with that. Our lack of engagement, our stepping back, our complaining and not voting in primaries nationally in this country in any significant way is on us. And so I am very keen to make that point to people who want to place all the blame on, 535 members of Congress in a White House, because I don't necessarily believe they deserve all of that.
My wife always says, if you don't vote, you can't complain about it.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And I would just underscore if we don't go to vote in primaries. I mean, the irony is not lost on me or shouldn't be lost on anybody else that the overriding thing is, is people don't like their choices. Well, we, many states ran primaries. I mean, you didn't, on the Republican side, they didn't rush right out and make a different decision. Those voters didn't, or on the Democratic side. And a lot of these states, the primary turnout is incredibly low and fairly disheartening when people are as frustrated with the choices that they have now, seemingly. It's like, can't we rewind and say, well, gosh, if we'd done this, but the last piece of it, to place blame in this portion of the conversation, we can give it to the political establishment, we can give it to the media, we can take some on ourselves, and then we also have to be smart about reforms too. I mean, what are some of the reforms that need to be looked at seriously, whether it's gerrymandering, whether it's campaign finance reform, whether it's ranked choice voting, and then what's going to work with this constitution in this moment in time. I mean, we're going to have to try, my feeling is we're going to have to try a number of things and call and shine a light, not live in the darkness, as they say, about a number of the things that help perpetuate dysfunction, before we get to the bottom of it.
What are some of the biggest challenges you've faced in promoting bipartisan cooperation, and how have you overcome them?
I say a lot. It's funny, Chris. I feel like I should be, not me. I mean, I work and created a bipartisan conversation, hope to do that, and it's on my tombstone when I go to heaven. But if I'm so lucky. But the first one is that this should be huge. I mean, I was looking at some Gallup numbers last night. 43% of people in this country consider themselves independents. Well, that is code for bipartisanship. That's code for people having some semblance of knowing that people have to work together and being unhappy self-identifying as a Republican or self-identifying as a Democrat. So the biggest frustration I have is just it's in the initial 45 or 30 to 45 seconds when I say I want to talk about bipartisanship. And it doesn't matter if I'm on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where I was last week for a luncheon, or if I'm talking to people when I'm at home in Northwest Ohio, or I'm talking to people on Zoom that I've never met. There is disbelief and exasperation and total frustration. And that's the hardest thing. Immediately. But then what I've learned is, and I feel quite privileged to be in this situation because I sit in Washington, D.C., and I get to spend a lot of time with senior staff and people that are elected and get to know them and see them interact with each other. I have amazing bipartisan stories of friendship and people working together. And these are stories that are very underreported, very not told, which is essentially the same thing. But the stories of bipartisanship, part of the reason that people are so skeptical is because bipartisan successes are not shouted from the rooftops. And because our system right now is currently obsessed with politics and not with governing. And those are two very different things. And we live now, at least in the culture, in a constant state of politics and never conversations about governing. And the irony is the only path forward is for people to work together. There is no other way. So when I get that first 30 seconds of oh my God, bipartisanship, it's like, but wait a second, there is no other way.
It's shocking. You mentioned earlier how you've got 10% each side of the parties. They're in the bully pulpit. I've always said that America's a bell curve where you've got 75 or 80% different shades of gray or purple here, but it's the ones with the bullhorn that get the viewers, the listeners, the social media hits. And to your point, that's very unfortunate because the things that are getting done, the bipartisanship projects and works that are being done are not getting the recognition they deserve.
And then more, yes to all of that, but also, we have a lot of big things coming up for this country and a lot of problems that need to be addressed. And so we have got the bell curve, as you say, those 75%, and you can call it 70 or, play with your numbers as much as you want, have got to make the decision to be heard. I mean, the classic example, or not classic, it is a classic example, but that sounds sort of quaint, and I mean it um, much more urgently than that, is there are 48 million family caregivers in this country. 7 out of 10 caregivers are women. That's women caring for an aging parent or sick child. The solutions are very difficult to find and they're very expensive. But the fact of the matter is these women suffer in silence. I so often living their lives doing it. I can't think of another sort of group of Americans. I mean, 48 million Americans is a large group. For instance, the AARP, which is the 50 plus Americans in this country, they say their membership is 33 million people, 33 or 38, one of the two. But the point is there are 48 million family caregivers. I mean, they don't all belong to a caregivers union. I mean, they are living their lives, putting one foot in the other, putting one foot in front of the other, rather. And so some of it is just too, that 75, if you will, your 75% bell curve point is that a lot of people don't know where to organize to come together. And so when I talk about my hope for engaged being a new women's movement, it is we are the place where women find that's not toxic, that's not too hot one way or the other, that makes them realize they've got to invest again in saying to members of Congress, I'm a caregiver and this is darn tough. Or I'm really worried about my daughter and what she's going to do with AI, and I don't want her to have a 4-year college, but whatever it is, we've got to start impressing upon them what our priorities are.
What strategies has Engaged Women found effective in getting leaders from opposing political parties to collaborate on economic security for women?
Look, I say a lot. Of 535 members of Congress, I don't know, there may be 10 or 20 bad apples. And by that, I mean, people that are not taking their job seriously or not responding to constituent mail or, being 100% a person that has 100% ideology about anything that doesn't want to sit with the other side. And I say that because most people, the vast majority in Congress of people that serve in Congress care desperately about this country and have come here because they want to do good work. And, behind the camera, there are lots and lots of them working wholeheartedly together, feeling each other out about what compromises might be, trying to understand what wiggle room they might have to persuade them to be with them on a certain amendment or a certain piece of legislation. So what's our strategy? Our strategy, really, quite frankly, is the goodness of many of them inherently. And it's also to be, and I don't mean this to sound too cute, but also be positive. I mean, for me, the thing that's most demoralizing and the thing that should be most urgently not tolerated is walking away from the table. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you walk away from the table at a compromising table and you say, I give up, I'm going to walk away, then you're essentially saying to the people that really need your help, I don't have to sit there and do this hard work anymore. And you're essentially saying you're saying to yourself, well, I guess they don't need, the little benefit that they were going to get, or they don't need this regulation changed, and I'm just going to be angry and walk away. That to me is what I find not in service of the American people.
You've mentioned a few times that women are a larger voting bloc, but despite them being a larger bloc, are there barriers preventing political leaders from prioritizing women's economic issues, or are there some other forces at work like inertia?
I think inertia is part of it, and I think that women's political interests have for far too long been sort of subcategorized in the reproductive rights space, right to life issues. Their economic challenges have been not seen as the priority of the nation. And I think COVID was one of the first lightning strikes, if you will, when Congress realized the vital piece that women play in this country's economic success and in their workforce. Um, there's some patriarchy involved in that. There's some condescension involved in that. There's women not being as organized as I think they should be, and all of that. So it's not one thing, but I think all of those are very fair to put on the list of reasons why um, women, and I also want to say, family policy, women and their children um, policy doesn't rank higher than it should, I believe.
Do you see any trends or bright spots where women's voting power is starting to shift the conversation toward economic security in political campaigns?
Yeah, I do. We Engage has spent the last 2 years working very closely with a Senate and House working groups dedicated to common sense solutions around paid family leave. And they are led in these groups in the House. It's led by Chrissy Houlihan, Representative Houlihan, and Representative Bice from Oklahoma and Pennsylvania, respectively. And in the Senate, it's led by Senator Gillibrand and Senator Cassidy. And these groups that have, I believe, 4 members, Republicans and Democrats on both sides, have worked diligently for 2 years, maybe a little bit longer, actually, on looking at what is possible, where agreement is, um, and what shot we have at doing something. And lots of advocates and NGOs and philanthropists have spent an incredible amount of time and resources over the last decade or so lifting up the challenges of family leave. And in the case of family leave, we really think of it as 4 buckets, if you will. There's parental leave, there's paid family and sick leave, and then there's military leave, and then family caregiving leave. And so, how, in the current state that we are in, budget wise in the United States, what is possible? How would it be paid for? And how can we get something over the finish line? We've been working really hard on that, and it's very exciting to see the spirit in which Republicans and Democrats in those working groups are working on it. Now, with that said, if this stuff was easy, it would be done already. I mean, it's really hard, and what's really hard about it is because everything is really expensive.
Well, and maybe as a follow up to that, do the Democrats and Republicans have different visions and approaches to achieve economic security for women?
Do they? Yes, I do. I think, and then I think there's vast agreement. I think these are stereotypes, but right, stereotypes happen for a reason. Democrats, as evidenced in Build Back Better, wanted to create and shape some new, very large programs. Republicans tend to not, well, tend to, that's being polite, I guess. Republicans are virtually never in that camp. They'd like to take smaller steps, see success before they create something big and expensive. I mean, look, when you give people something, anybody, you give me something, you give you something, Chris, it's very hard to take it away. We like what we have. So, we're in they play their roles well, that tension, they play it well. But there's vast agreement in what the challenges are. It's just very difficult to figure out how to pay for it. And again, this is where the majority of women need to get engaged in a new way and say, this is the priority. This is our priority. You may think that this is your priority, but we're the ones that go to the polls and vote. And we're telling you that our number one priority is retirement security, or our number one priority is parental leave. And so your priority may be quite different than mine, but I'm the one that gets to vote for you. So, hear me roar, basically. And that's where we have the elective power. We can say, it's not quite this simple, but women could say, and polling shows it, for instance, that these are the things they're thinking about. So, hear us.
What new laws would you like to see to address women's economic security, and what's it going to take to get them enacted?
I would like to see some aid given to family caregivers. I would like to see some aid given on the paid family leave side, as I just was referencing. And I would very much like to see some new thinking on childcare and some new thinking on people that work in childcare. We're vastly under resourced, I guess would be the spiffy way of saying we don't have nearly enough childcare in this country. Senators Britt and Senators Kane, right before Congress left for October, introduced some new legislation for childcare and childcare providers. Those areas are very important and very important to women. And I feel not hopeful for all of them, but I also feel hopeful that in this next Congress, we have a real shot at addressing some family policy that has not been addressed for quite a while.
We've been talking about bipartisanship throughout the show. Can you share a success story or two where bipartisan collaboration led to tangible economic benefits for women?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm also famous in my own mind, Chris, and maybe my family's just a small family, so I don't mean it as self-aggrandizing, but I'm famous in that I can make everything a women's economic security argument. Just give me something, and I'll tie it right back. But we can argue with the way uh, the COVID relief packages happened, but the Senate responded, the Congress responded very quickly and very succinctly in keeping many women and many women's small businesses afloat during that time and many families afloat. We cannot say maybe it was too much and too long, and it's part of the reason we have the price tag or the debt rather that we do, but that was real action to save Americans and Americans and their families. I would also say in the infrastructure bill, all the money that has yet to be realized, which is frustrating to me, but around broadband is really, really important, and rural broadband. I mean, broadband is a women's economic security issue. It was easy to sort of say that during COVID when women were driving around parking lots looking for Wi-Fi so that their kids could go to school. But I don't know how anybody is supposed to survive today if you can't apply for a job, if you don't have the capacity for telehealth, if you don't have the capacity to talk to your teacher's schools, if you don't have the capacity to pay your bills online. So the massive investment that the government has made in broadband, again, yet to be realized in their challenges, but though that is a significant thing. And quite frankly, some Republicans took some heat for voting for that large of an expenditure, and a lot of Republicans didn't vote for it. So those are two biggies that don't often get looked at that way, which is why I think you also have to cast a broad lens about it, because people don't think of broadband being a women's economic security issue, but it absolutely is.
Rachel Pearson, as someone who's an only child from a single mom, thank you for the work that you do.
Oh, bless your heart. You must have one amazing mom.
She was a rock star.
Well, thank you for having me. There are a lot of rock stars out there,
Yes, there are.
and a lot of women without children, but like myself, who's a very proud aunt and is participating in the family and very proud of my nephew and all that he's accomplishing. So I always want to be reminded. I always be mindful of the women that not only are doing it solo, like your cool mom, or getting to be an aunt like me, or just a woman that's lit up by being an entrepreneur and may not have children, but is creating jobs and economic growth for America. So hats off to everybody.
I'm Chris Meek. We're out of time. We'll see you next week, same time, same place. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.